Let's take a look at Landsberg's The Experience of Death. Really, the first thing you should notice about this, which is of interest to us particularly, is the title of the work, The Experience of Death. That is a difficult subject. If we go back to the beginning of the course and think about what Epicurus said about death, it was clearly implied that death cannot be experienced. Landsberg is not satisfied with that. There is some reference later on in the essay, we'll get to it, where he does mention Epicurus, gives some time to Epicurus, and dismisses Epicurus. And one wonders if that is entirely fair, but in any case, you could read this in part as an attempt to avoid the kind of strictures that Epicurus lays down in terms of the experience of death. Certainly under an Epicurean view of death, death cannot be experienced. Landsberg is looking for, despite what Epicurus might say, looking for the experience of death. And if we look at the first question there, we're also reminded of the last set of readings, especially the readings from the reading by Glenn Gray about existentialism. This opening question, what is the meaning of death to the human being as a person, that's an existentialist question. And to a certain extent, Landsberg is an existentialist, but of a different sort, as we'll see. One of the things, again, we'll see in terms of what we've been reading so far is that not only is Landsberg departing from Epicurus, but he has Heidegger squarely in his sights. And what I mean specifically is this notion of being towards death, human existence as essentially directed towards its own nothingness, which is, I think, what major thing that Gray was trying to get across in terms of what Heidegger is about, what a certain type of existentialism is about. That is acknowledging acknowledging mortality in the sense of it being our absolute end, no afterlife, no continued existence. Acknowledging that that is the fate of us all, and that every moment we are heading closer to it is the precondition for living in the truth. So Landsberg certainly, in opposing that idea, is going to have to give us a different idea of what that means, that is, living in the truth. We'll see that Landsberg's idea of the structure of human existence is, you might call it a being beyond death. We'll get to that when it comes, but that is one way of beginning to compare, to distinguish the existentialists, at least represented by Heidegger, and Landsberg, who might be called a Christian existentialist or a Christian phenomenologist, as we'll see. That one is saying that human existence is a being towards death, where the other, Landsberg, is certainly saying that human existence is, in its essential structure, in its essence, a being beyond death. And we'll see why he has to say that. But he is seeking the experience of death. And that's not such an easy thing. Again, the opening about Voltaire and David Hume is really looking at the very strange question of how we know about death. If Voltaire is quoted here as saying that human beings know, the human race is the only one that knows it must die, and it knows this only through its experience, which is paradoxical. That is, the knowing we must die and knowing it from our experience. The must die means that death is a necessity, but experience doesn't really give us, that is, our experience of death, of things dying, doesn't really give us evidence of the necessity of death. I mean, we know that we will die, and maybe we even know that we must die. But the problem of induction is that just from something repeatedly happening, it doesn't mean that it must happen again. It's a very old question in philosophy. You know, the old problem of induction, if you are shown a bunch of apples, individual apples, let's say hundreds and thousands, and say all the apples that you've ever experienced are red, that doesn't prove that all apples are red. You may think that on the basis of your experience, but you'd be wrong, of course. But we know that living organisms die, and everyone that has existed has died. And on the basis of that, we know that we'll die too. But just like with the red apples, it doesn't prove that every living thing must die, or that every living thing will eventually die. Common sense tells us that it's true, but we can't be absolutely sure of the necessity of it. And that's really the problem he's dealing with there. This question of, how do we come to a knowledge of death in our experience, and especially how do we come to a knowledge of the necessity of death? So he says this here at the bottom of page 194. Is there a specific experience of death through which one might learn that death was natural to man, to human beings, in the wholeness of his personal life? And this experience, which already allows us to establish the fact of considerable probability, that's the idea that, we pretty much all but sure that everything that's alive will die. Does it also confront us with the fact of necessity, that the must die? So that's sort of a background question in the essay that follows, looking for how do we know that we must die? How do we know that death is a necessity for us? But for us, in what respect? Another thing you might want to think about in a preliminary way as you're reading Landsberg is this word person that he uses in the opening question. The meaning of death to the human being as a person. That couldn't be more important. And I will spend considerable time in these talks trying to clarify the distinction between human being and person. Person is a word in philosophy that it has some technical significance. Being a person, personhood, sometimes called selfhood, is a distinction made from merely being a human being, a member of the species Homo sapiens. What is a person as opposed to a human being? It's actually a very big question, especially in moral philosophy. But for Landsberg, it has huge importance, being a person, and that actually will show up in this reading in section 3 when he talks about individualization, the individualization and the experience of death. You might think of personhood as becoming an individual. But before we get to that, there is this section 2 where he discusses Max Scheler, the contemporary philosopher. Max Scheler's answer to what the experience of death actually is, which is quite interesting, even though Landsberg immediately rejects it. Remember, philosophers like Scheler, phenomenologists, were looking at experience, looking to describe experience. And so he was trying to describe our experience as human beings of death. How do we experience death? Again, always keeping in mind Epicurus' answer that we don't and that we can't. Scheler said that the experience of death is the experience of growing old. This is page 195, where Landsberg, in describing Scheler's thought, says, what he has described in his profound and deeply illuminating manner is the experience of growing old. According to him, the idea of death occurs only as a limiting point, which one may foresee by observing the development of the process of growing old. The structure of our life changes noticeably at every moment. The pressure of the past grows heavier, and the possibilities of the future more narrow. Man feels himself less and less free, less and less capable of transforming the meaning of his life by shaping his future. As he grows old, he loses not only the sense of freedom, but to a certain degree, freedom itself. Very interesting answer from Scheler. I've not been able to find Scheler's original text in English. I don't read German, and I don't think it's ever been translated. But a very interesting idea that basically the experience of death, Scheler says, is the experience of approaching death, aging. the death is a limiting point, which is an interesting idea because that would preserve the Epicurean idea that we can't actually experience the moment of death as it occurs, but we can experience getting closer to it. And that experience is an experience of the narrowing of possibility, the narrowing of our horizon, where the past gets bigger and bigger, what's behind you in terms of time. And what's ahead of you gets smaller and smaller, and there's a sort of a shrinking of possibilities there, which is quite interesting, and I have to say, in certain respects, quite true. And Landsberg would agree. He says, here, no doubt, is a terrible truth. I mean, the first time when your legs give out, I don't know if if you're old enough to experience that. It's true what they say, the legs are the first thing to go. And if you, say, play basketball and you're used to, playing at a certain height, I was never a great basketball player, but I at least could touch the rim. And then had a rather embarrassing moment in my 30s where I hadn't played basketball in a long time. And actually trying to show off, grab the rim. I could never dunk, but I could touch the rim. And I must have missed it by a foot. I just waved at it. And that was a really interesting moment. You at a certain point physically, you simply can't do what you did before, and you never will be able to recover it. You can't do everything in life. And that was a certain interesting experience of narrowing. When our hair falls out or gets gray, or our body just doesn't respond, and our mind. These are the kind of things that Scheler was talking about, and that is a sign you're getting older, and getting older does mean getting closer to death. So there's something very, very interesting about Scheler's analysis, but Landsberg rejects it, and for good reason, because this couldn't be the universal experience of death, growing old, because not everyone gets to grow old. As he says, death in most cases intervenes quite early, biologically speaking, and can only be considered natural in very rare cases where it does in fact appear as the culmination of old age. People die young. People die without having that experience. So although it's a very interesting idea, this experience of the narrowing of horizons as we grow old, the truth is that it's not universal. So if we're going to find a more universal and essential experience of the experience of death, it will not be in the experience of growing old. So then the question is, of course, what kind of thing we're suggesting? And that we'll see, hopefully, in the next video.